Hello, everybody. So we're having a little impromptu stream. My friends Serp and Terilien were on, and Serp's been doing some reading about China, and people have been harassing me constantly to have him back on. So I figured we'll just do a little impromptu stream, and we'll talk. We're talking about somebody's always saying he's saying in the chat that this is a based cope stream, which could very well be true. But we're going to be talking about the reality or the possibility of China becoming the next, I don't know. Serp, how would you put it? Like as a superpower?
The monolithic power that controls everything. Basically. So I've read 2 books about China now. I'm not going to be an expert, but what I just finished was an Audible book on China Rules the World by a British Marxist or former Marxist or post-Marxist who apparently had a brown girl fetish, Martin Jacqui. And I think that like his brown girl fetish like keeps like coming into it like a big deal. When he talks about China, like China's gonna bend the fuck over the United States. And like
Martin Jacques.
yeah.
Yep.
So basically, does Terilien want to say hi?
Hi, it's Terilien.
Oh yeah, I also have Terilien on. If you guys haven't checked it out, him and Nice Meme Fryer have a podcast called Isiliador's Shack. I'm going to put a link to it. And Serp is actually on it the most recent time, and he's put it up on his channel as well. If you're looking for him, he's done a couple live streams lately, but mostly he's putting up content on Bitchute just because a lot of it's kind of spicy.
And the podcast is surprisingly good, apparently, somehow. And yeah. And we'll have our next episode up sometime this weekend.
What are you going to do
if
it
all
on?
things. Demons having sex with people.
Sorry, the podcast is about having sex with people?
No, about demons
Oh,
having
demons having sex. Okay. That sounds hot.
Anyway, I hope you guys will enjoy. Let's
Let's start this. So when China rules the world, the model that Aki is talking about is basically the United States, the concept of the hyperpower, which is the United States is basically able to shape the entire world.
Sorry, if I could just take a step back. Okay, so in the 19th century, you had this, and this is probably goes back further than this, but you had the concept of the great powers, in which there was a number of countries that were, I don't know if roughly equal, but were strong enough that they could project their influence all throughout the world. So, like, the great powers of the 19th century were like France, Britain, Russia, eventually Germany. Japan was kind of the last one to join the great power family. And then I guess kind of heading into World War II, you start to have the superpower who was so much stronger than the other countries. They kind of could by themselves shift the
It's a
world.
country that can project, a superpower can project power on a global scale. A hyperpower can not only do that, but they don't have any competitors.
Yeah, they have no one is realistically able to challenge them. Like I would say at the time of World War II, sorry if I'm getting slightly off topic, I'd say the Soviet Union, America, and Germany were all superpowers at that point. Or became that.
I don't believe in the concept of the superpower, so I just kind of, I'm actually going to critique that.
Oh, okay. Do you believe it? Like, I think the term great power, though, is okay.
I believe in great power, I don't believe in superpower.
Okay.
Because the model that he's going after is this idea that the United States is this hyperpower, and he like kind of like sweeps away the concept of like the Soviet Union being a superpower and the United States both being a superpower at the same time because it doesn't fit his hypothesis. His hypothesis is basically the country with the highest purchasing power parity will become basically ipso facto the hyperpower, and then will be able to influence all of world culture and will be able to shape the world based on its own power. And so he retroactively makes the United Kingdom into this superpower, and then the United States into a superpower, and then China will then subsume the United States once it has a high enough purchasing power parity. When is this supposed to happen?
I don't know. You're the one who read the book.
No, I'm looking at the current estimate. It's supposed to be by 2028 now. China is supposed to have a larger economy than the United States. Okay, so China will have a larger economy by the United States, and basically this is what isn't destined for war, which is the other book I read about the subject, which is Graham Allison's book, is basically like China is just so big that it is just like smack the US out of the way and becomes hyperpower. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's ignoring that we'll get later, especially China's pathway dependency. And that China is headed towards China doesn't have a high enough birth rate to contain its growth. It still has a lower birth rate than the United States. And it looks like it's projected to basically be stuck in the middle income trap because of its pathway dependency on selling consumer goods to the West. Now, Japan, of course, Japan and South Korea and all the Asian tigers are built on selling, not necessarily to the West, but selling consumer products. And this is how they industrialized and how Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan became first world nations, the so-called Asian tigers. But China has very low quality consumer goods, and that they've never gotten to the point where they have high quality. Why Japan
haven't they all
still dominates high quality.
Isn't their domestic market also very underdeveloped?
Yes.
Compared to Japan.
So basically the guy's just saying that like China will just by the measure of its size and because of like he doesn't give any reasons, he just says that it'll happen a lot of times. Jackie, that China will just move into this like higher quality consumer goods and then basically dominate the world by the size of its own economy. But like he doesn't believe in race, correct? Like he doesn't believe in race. He's a Marxist, so he doesn't believe in race. He doesn't believe in intelligence. But India is supposed to surpass China in total population in 2027. So why should China become the sole superpower under his own beliefs when India would become the biggest country in the world? Clearly, it should become the sole superpower.
Not to mention, India has food security.
India has food security. India might even have a better naval tradition, for all I know.
I mean, it is a net exporter of food.
Well,
yes.
I mean, even if a lot of it's bullshit.
And India never had a one-child policy, so even if it's declining or it has...
they had pretty brutal...
selective abortion.
Well, that or just forced sterilization and stuff. It never reached
but they still have 2.1 Argent, which would mean that they would... I'm sure that there's disparities, but they're not as severe as China's disparities, and they're still above the 2.1.
I think the advantage China has is China is at least theoretically more culturally homogenous and more centralized and unified compared to India.
Yes, but his sole hypothesis is basically size of the total economy.
Oh, okay. So the fact that the Chinese state is much stronger isn't like a...
No, not really. I mean, he doesn't even touch on like that you could just criticize an entire thing by saying, well, India is going to be better sooner and it will continue to grow longer than China, and that it will maintain this highest as long as there's not a nuclear war or an actual pandemic. Because I mean, of course, like the whole hypothesis is stated on the fact of like non-nuclear war and like indefinite stability and so on and so forth. But
I just want to interrupt for a sec. I think we're in a very weird geopolitical world at the moment, because I'd say we have like America, the super or hyperpower, In terms of great powers, the only ones I can think of are the EU and Russia. I can't really think of
I
any.
think that China is a great power.
Yeah,
I think
China.
Russia is a great power. I think that India sort of is moving into that category, and I think the United Kingdom has a large enough navy that you could argue that it is a great power. Like United Kingdom's navy tradition, and that it has the power to project power. Both France
I think
and
it's.
the United
I
Kingdom
think
maintain
France.
the
You can
power
make
of
an
naval
argument. I
projection.
think the UK's has decayed to the point where it's. I'd agree on France though. France has a pretty strong. The thing with France is there is a very strong sense of nationalism even among the left, and a strong military. I think has always been a thing in France.
Could we just what are some of China's problems? Like, what are
No, can I return to my criticism of this idea of the
sure.
hyperpower?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, the United Kingdom never had the power of the United States at any one point of its height of the Great Century of Britain. If you're going to say the Great Century is from 1914 to 1815, the United Kingdom never ever reached the heights of the power of the United States had after 1945. The United Kingdom could never engage in a land war against any other great power and hope to win. The United Kingdom had the greatest navy in the world, but it simply couldn't project its power on land in the way that the United States or the Russian Empire or the French Empire / Third Republic could have.
Well, like if we
and
look at,
we kind of what?
I was just gonna say, if we look at the Napoleonic Wars, okay, so Britain did fight in some of the other theaters, particularly Spain, but its main contribution was blockading the ports and giving money to the other powers that were in more of a position to fight a land war.
So I just really don't like how a historic, because he's trying to create this thing where there was, when Britain, what he goes back is he says like Britain industrialized and Britain was a superpower for 100 years, and then the United States was a superpower for 100 years, and then China will have the greatest economy in the world and it'll be the superpower, and just to see the United States like the power, like he doesn't understand why Britain does. He gets into like the concept of the Industrial Revolution, but like the reason the West was able to overpower the East in the Industrial Revolution doesn't mean somehow you flip it back and China's going to overpower the West or the United States or India or even Japan, because China is now going to be industrialized and will be the biggest industrial country in the world. Because he's saying like the West was able to influence the East, and that when China rises again, its power is the biggest country in the world, and thus the biggest economy in the world. It will be able to culturally influence the West and will like secede and become a hyperpower. But the hyperpower thing never existed. There is a very short period in history where you could argue the United States was the sole great power. In the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But even then, like China, even in the 70s, you could argue China was a great power, and like France could still globally project itself, as we're saying. So he's trying to, like, he has this kind of like fetishization of the West being like pushed out by China, and China basically like forcing its culture on the world.
If we're just going to talk in purely military terms, I think China's decades and decades behind the U.S. Like, just in terms of like, because I get that we can talk about the military-industrial complex, but the U.S. has a large fleet of very impressive carriers.
I don't want to go into the carrier sinking conversation, but I'm gonna say you're right. Because the reason that the West was able to project its power and force China and all these other countries, why the West became so powerful and conquered everybody else is because of its naval tradition. And why the United States maintains its power and the free trade is hinged upon, global free trade is hinged upon global safe seas, or like the United States and Britain being able to export their power through their massive and incredible navies.
Okay,
but China has no naval tradition.
No,
so
I'm just
China
saying,
can't
like, they
be
have, like, some
quote-unquote superpower.
shitty ex-Russian carrier. I just think it'd be decades before China could come close to, like, anything vaguely approaching the US
And here's the
Navy.
thing: you can have all money in the world, that's not going to buy you a naval mission or all the skills necessary to make all the tools that you need. You can have trillions and trillions of dollars. You're still going to have to spend decades and decades and decades building up the necessary infrastructure, educational and physical, to cause that to translate into a superpower. And that's implying you have no obligations or whatever, or your money isn't tied up anywhere.
Well, they have to. Here's something else. They have to engage
Serp,
the
could you put
pre-existing
headphones
powers. Me?
Yeah. Just, I'm echoing.
Echo.
But,
They have to engage the pre-existing powers on their naval bases to expand their naval bases outward. Because, to be blunt, the United States, France, maybe a little bit Japan and Britain have all the premier naval bases in the world. They're the only countries that can really have blue water navies. Even to expand into the South China Sea, China has to create artificial islands for its navy to expand and to project power.
well, don't they have bad relations with, like, Vietnam and, like, some other obvious places to have naval bases?
Yeah, well, they don't really. China has no allies.
Doesn't
This is where you're getting, like, people have criticized this, and like, keep in mind, I'm a believer in the United States collapsing. But what I'm saying is that China is going to be a great power, but China is not going to assume this hyperpower status that the United States had between, I don't know, 1991 and 2008.
Well,
like, China won't be as powerful as the United States was in that time period.
I don't know what the relations are like between Indonesia and China, but I think Indonesia is generally more pro-West. Like, I don't think anybody likes China except for the people who they pay, and even they don't really like them. They just take their money.
Well, I believe China only has one overseas naval base, and that's in Atrida.
And
Eritrea.
I think this is something I believe you said a while back, that for most of its history, the U.S. was a pretty good sugar daddy to have. They just wanted you to say communism bad, socialism bad, and they'd give you money and weapons. China demands, like, you become their debt slave for all
Which
time.
is like, well, okay, Terilien, do you want to explain why the debt slave stuff isn't going to work?
People could just default on their loans and you won't be able to do anything about it.
Well, you have to have power projection to use your navy.
I
mean, like, it reminds me of all this stuff of, like, France and Britain bombarding Mexico.
I mean, I just want to say this. All throughout history, okay, countries have defaulted on their debts. Monarchs have defaulted on their debts, and you know what happened to them? Basically nothing. You have any idea how many times countries like France and the like have failed to meet their financial obligations and basically says, you're going to get 10 million or you're going to get nothing. And no one can do anything about it because money ain't guns. Okay? And when you've lent to someone, you're not the one who even has the money anymore. So what are you going to do about it? I mean, yes, there have been cases where countries have been invaded because they owed money. But usually these countries invaded those countries were already powerful and they were already rich. And the debt was just a pretext to seize strategic territory. Usually, okay, a country that owes money is destitute in some way, monetarily. And so invading them is going to cost a crap ton of money. And the country that is their creditor, you know, unless China's already incredibly wealthy, is going to have a hard time enforcing its will on that poorer country. But the problem is that China has invested so much in a system where they imagine debts will be honored and paid.
Well,
which is based on the United States.
That is basically building your house on a foundation of sand.
Well,
I'll just give a quick analogy if I can, and then I'll let you talk, Argent. Let's say I pay someone to kill someone. Okay? What's to stop them from just taking the money and stabbing me? Money will only get you so far, and China doesn't even have that much money. You can't rely solely on money. Anyway, go on, Argent.
I was going to say, well, a lot of the Chinese economy and their supposed ability to become a world superpower is based on the amount of U.S. debt they own and their ability to fuck America. But if they do that, then their economy collapses. So basically, they're like, what they've done is they have some sort of like, I don't know, IV from their mortal enemy, and they're receiving blood from their mortal enemy. And like, they're like, oh, we can rip it out and then we both bleed to death. And it's just like, it's, if they actually want to use any of their influence, it's gonna fuck them like just as bad. I don't know if that makes any sense.
America could just default and basically say, "What you gonna do about it? We still have the bigger and better army." Bitch.
I think it would hurt America a lot because the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, even if it's bullshit, is kind of the basis of the global economic system.
But that would hurt everyone.
Well, the United States created
China.
the United States, or the global West financial system, created the IMF, right? Mm-hmm. And we can talk about the IMF or like the international finance controls the United States. The United States is like democracy is pointless or whatever. But all of China's debt games is based on using the existing financial system. So if this financial system collapsed, then all its debt slavery games don't matter anymore.
Yeah.
It has to use the current financial system to even gain this so-called unstoppable soft power.
I got a good example. Okay, so America is a casino, and China goes into the casino and wins like all the chips in the casino, but the chips only have value so long as there's a casino they can cash them in at. So like they've gained influence in all of these organizations that are fundamentally based upon America's power.
Also, Argent, the casino owner is a really, really, really buff guy, and China is a little dweeb, and the buff guy just says, "You didn't win anything," and just punches him in the face.
Terilien.
Uh-huh.
I'm not even going with this idea that I'm already going on the idea that America has failed, and that America will become a puppet state of China because of how easy it is to influence America's economy as sown through Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Even in this context, like I said, they can just default and just say, "Nah, we're not going to pay you," and then shut down.
I don't know how much of it is like a meme, but from my understanding, isn't Biden's cabinet, like including him, like all shills for China and like completely bought and sold?
Yes. Even then, it doesn't really matter. Because so I think that all these people are thinking I'm talking about the United States. Like the United States is going to somehow maintain its power over and against China. And that we have this weird idea that the United States is this hyperpower. And that the natural order of the universe, and this is what's deeply ingrained in Jackie's book, is that there's going to be this sole power that influences all culture around the world. Well, the reason that Britain and the United States are able to influence power so much is because of their naval tradition, and that their ability to project hard power across the world.
Not to mention, in the case of the United States, the U.S. has direct access the two most important oceans. China only has direct access to one.
Well, China has natural. The United Kingdom and the United States are very clear natural naval powers, while China is not. But there's more to this as well. I'm just gonna say this: English is an easier language to learn than Chinese.
At least when it
English
comes to
can
writing
work.
it, yes.
English can work as a global franco like Chinese, easier as a lingua franca than Chinese can.
That's very true.
And second of all, the reason that Britain and the United States were able to gain this power is simply because of the industrialization and the second wave of imperialism. Even if China does, like, if China is able to put itself out of the middle income trap and abandon its pathway dependency, which the book itself was written and
Sorry, can we
published in
just take a step
2009.
back and explain what we mean by pathway? So, from my understanding, pathway dependency is that...
Could I explain it?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Terilien.
Pathway dependency is the idea that you can take several pathways to do something. So, for example, back in 1900, it was, no one really knew what they were going to use to run cars. You might have used electricity, you might have used oil, gasoline, whatever have you. But then eventually you use one of those things, and then you build an infrastructure and all sorts of things around it. And then then you're not really able to go back because all of your economy is built around doing that task using those methods.
Okay, I had the complete wrong understanding. I thought by pathway dependency you were referring to how China was dependent upon certain sea lanes that are very easy to block, and those were the pathways.
No. So yeah, that's basically pathway dependency. And in the case of China, they have built their economy around a few things, and
Cheap export customer or consumer good exports of low
Terilien,
quality.
you're in a good position to answer this. Someone's saying phones can translate audio and text, so the language barrier isn't an issue.
do these people realize how bad machine translation is?
I've tried because there's some visual novels that haven't been translated into, well, a lot that haven't been translated. So I tried playing with like a machine translation, and it's horrible. Like
Yes, especially when it's anything complicated or context dependent, it will just completely crashes. And
names
there
are
hard
especially
limits.
bad.
There are hard limits to just how good machine translation or computer-based translation. I'm not going to go into details, and I'm certainly not an expert on machine translation. But literally, just try to translate a text on Google Translate and tell me that machine translation is good, and especially when you're talking about very different languages.
Especially if you're not Kurt Doolittle.
It's bad enough. I'm sorry if I'm being mean, but it's bad enough trying to use Google Translate for languages that are relatively similar, like German and English. For many languages, machine translation will just crash, especially if there are huge pragmatic differences between the languages. And I mean, when it comes to translating spoken language, forget it. Computers can't tell the difference between I scream, I as in eyeball, scream, and ice cream. There are so many issues of translating spoken language. Anyway, due to things like major phonemic reduction, and all that make information irrecoverable. Anyway.
Okay, so now that we have pathway dependency down, let's explain what China's pathway dependency is. China is attempting to. China was able to grow its economy so fast because it specialized in labor-intensive manufacturing of low-quality consumer goods. Throughout the book, or in one lengthy section, he says basically China has to leave this pathway dependency in order to shift towards their own consumer base and the wider consumer base of Asia, and push out the higher and transition to not just low quality but also high quality consumer goods, and sell high quality consumer goods back into China itself. So there's this concept of the middle income trap, where this is where the countries that use their labor as a comparative advantage, once their economy takes off, they eventually get stuck in this area of middle income because their labor as a comparative advantage shrinks and it's no longer becomes a comparative advantage. So they're essentially just stuck where their labor is the value that it's actually worth relative to everything else worldwide. And the only way to escape this is do what the East Asian Tigers did, or what Ireland did, which is focus on a high quality export of consumer goods, as far as we know. China's trying to do this with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, also these
and
countries
the Made
have
in
very
China 2025 and can I finish the sentence? Sorry, I don't want to be an asshole. The Made in 2025 China initiative, which from my understanding haven't gone really anywhere. What were you going to say, Arjun?
These countries also have highly developed domestic markets, whereas from my understanding, China really doesn't.
Mm-hmm. China's not developed its domestic market, and what's happening is that instead of trying to diversify, China doubled down on its original advantage, and it will lose its comparative advantage and become stuck in the middle income trap. So it's difficult to know, but China had like a 10% or 11% GDP increase. And before COVID, it had shrunk down to 6%. So China will continue to grow fast in the United States, but it'll eventually reach parity in growth where the United States would be right now. And it'll have 4% and then eventually 3 to 2% growth. And then China has a similar, despite it being so poor, it has a similar birth rate to South Korea or Japan. And because of that, it won't have the labor advantage anyway that it once had, and this will further cement itself in the middle income trap, and it won't be able to contain these huge, which have diminished over time. So I believe before the COVID depression,
if I can add something,
to like 6%. Yeah.
Is it possible that a lot of this plays into path dependency, that a lot of the skills that go into serving the market for cheap consumer goods are very, very hard to transfer into making high quality goods, but all their income is dependent on those cheap consumer goods, and so they're kind of like in a really, really difficult bind as a result?
Mm-hmm. They're in a bind, but the Chinese Communist Party's leadership is, I don't know, I don't want to say it like this, but I don't know how to say it in any other terms. Very, very conservative and not innovative. So instead of trying to diversify out of it, they seem to have doubled down on maintaining what caused the initial growth, which will probably mean they'll be stuck in the middle income trap. It's clear, if it hasn't already happened, China's going to surpass the United States in purchasing power parity, but regardless, it'll get itself stuck in the middle income trap, and it will be the largest economy in the world, probably indefinitely for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean that it will have anywhere near like the GDP per capita of Japan. And because of in the Cold War, of course, even though this is where you get into the 1980s, where 18% of the Soviet economy, to create parity with the United States, 18% of the Soviet economy was dedicated to the arms industry. 6% of the U.S. economy was, or 4% of it was. And that, because Japan could conceivably will still have a much higher GDP per capita, how much it devotes to its arms industry would be much less than China, because China's GDP has to be devoted to much more stuff because it's so much lower per capita.
Serp, someone's asking for a brief definition of the middle income trap.
I'll just read off Wikipedia here.
Okay.
Is an economic development situation in which a country attains a certain income due to its given advantages, but it gets stuck at that level. It was introduced by the World Bank in 2006. It is defined as the middle income range of countries where the gross national product per capita is between $1,000 and $2,000 at 2011 prices.
Basically, what happens is you use the fact that labor is cheap to make in your country to make money, but that raises the demand, and it reaches a kind of equilibrium where if you got any richer, you would lose your advantage from having cheap labor. And if you got any poorer, well, you'd get poorer. And so you're just stuck at that equilibrium level, and you can't get higher from it, especially if you've built your entire economic model around leveraging your cheap labor.
Yes. So countries that use
Like
their cheap
sweatshops.
labor as a comparative advantage, what will happen is the more developed their country is through the use of their comparative advantage of the higher amount of labor, or the lower cost of labor, I should say, both higher amount with China, but also the lower cost, is that their advancement economically will raise their living conditions, and conversely, it will cause their labor to become more costly, which traps them basically and prevents them from growing their economy more, meaning that they're indefinitely stuck in the equilibrium of the middle income.
To give a poignant example, you get richer by having sweatshops come to your country, but eventually your labor costs are that's gonna lead to rising labor costs due to increased demand, and then the sweatshops are gonna start leaving your country until the prices go back down.
So maybe another way to put it is it's very hard to switch from a labor intensive economy to a capital intensive economy, because you lose your comparative advantage in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because like Japan has a capital intensive economy, so I mean their birth rate sucks, but I don't think it's as big a deal as.
Keep in mind, in China, like you hear about like, oh, China has tons of engineers. Yeah, an engineer in China is like a glorified mechanic.
Well, it was in the Soviet Union, of course.
Yeah, it was like that in the Soviet Union as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think also something I've asked is, does China, like, how interested in are they in like ruling the world? Like America, Britain, Russia, the Soviet Union, I think had some sort of universalist impulse to, if not rule the world, then to influence it. I don't really know how much China like wants to influence the world.
China's a turtle.
Well, I mean, beyond getting raw materials to make China economy strong. Like, I don't think they're ideologically driven, really.
I mean, as far as I know, a lot of China's activities in Africa are just driven by the need to increase security, although I don't really know, or I don't know much.
There is, particularly with Mao, there was like a prestige thing. Like, there wasn't really a purpose beyond like jealousy that Senpai had, like people liked Russia and no one liked him. So
can I say,
yep.
I think that China has, I think that they don't have so you could say that the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States had this missionary zeal in the case of the Anglosphere countries to spread free markets and or democracy, or so-called human rights, across the world, and in the case of the Soviet Union to spread communism. I think that China has none of these, but I think that China has some sense that they want to have revenge on their enemies. I think that China wants to have revenge on Japan, right? Or China wants to retake Taiwan, or it wants to project it wants to destroy the Vietnamese Navy and take over the 9-dash line. But China doesn't really have the goal of like spreading Taoism or Confucianism to like Africans.
I think China also, I mean, Britain was an island that wasn't self-sufficient, so it kind of had a drive for that. Also, America is just huge. China kind of has natural borders, and isn't it kind of isolated because of its natural borders?
Yes, traditionally,
It
yeah.
has lots of mountains. Even in the even along the northern borders, there's a lot of
Well,
mountains
or
and
it's
desert,
wasteland, and
like the Gobi Desert.
or just it's cold and not really useful. Um,
Manchuria.
yeah, although Manchuria has quite a bit of resources. I just mean like if you go further north than that, or you go into like Mongolia or something. China is like pretty big. I don't think they have a universally. Also, China is just extremely xenophobic. I'm not saying that is
Yeah.
like a bad thing necessarily, but as like a descriptor. So I don't really know how much influence, like how much they want to deal with the foreign devils. In terms of
So
like,
here's something else when we're talking about these natural borders.
mm-hmm.
China's going to run into like three great powers around it, right? So China's going to run against Japan as a great power because I'm even predicating on this idea that I believe the United States will either pull back its military force in the world and become a Brazil or outright collapse. Japan, if this happens, I doubt that Japan will maintain Article 9, which has been slivered away slowly over time. Japan will become a nuclear capable world with a strong naval tradition, which has better naval prospects than China. China
And
very
much higher
rarely
human capital.
much higher human capital. Japan will be able to build allies throughout Asia to basically essentially maintain China. Um, because Japan, say what you will about Japan historically, China doesn't have outside allies even today with all its economic influence. I don't think that Japan of World War II is considered as bad even maybe as the United States of or whatever I'm trying to say. China's pretty bad. You don't want to be ruled over Chinese people. Japanese people don't seem that bad.
Well, I mean,
Russia as well has an extremely high level of military capital and human capital, which maintains itself above China. Russia, as it stands right now, is already a great power. Russia has. There's no reason why Russia should collapse further than it already did in the Soviet Union. Um, and I don't know if I talked about this on stream before. Russia's military technology is usually superior than that of the United States if they have the ability to spend the same amount of money. Most of Russia's rocketry, missiles, anti-air missiles, and many times is superior to the United States, and its aircraft are often comparable, as well as its like tanks and stuff.
Pound for pound.
And finally, we have India, which, according to Jackie's own logic, should basically supplant China anyway. But obviously, as a believer in the reality of race, I think that India will lag behind and it will get stuck in its own middle income trap. But that doesn't mean that India won't be able to use its massive amount of manpower and be able to ally with the other countries of Asia to try and contain Chinese influence.
well, you're forgetting
Let's not forget the Straits of Malacca.
Well,
yes, and most importantly of all, China can be stopped with a nuclear-armed Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, China is highly, highly, highly dependent on food imports. I think a lot of them probably come from India.
You guys are forgetting too. South Korea, while not necessarily a great power, has an extremely like large and well-equipped military, and I don't think. And Vietnam also hates China, and even if they aren't the most developed, they still have like a huge population.
Literally, all anyone has to do is look at how China treats its minorities, and no country's gonna want to support China as the regional hegemon.
Once again, I just want to make this clear because people are going to accuse this of being like a marriage shield or something. I'm not saying that the U.S. isn't shit. I'm just saying like the people who LARP that when China is going to be this benevolent hegemon and they're going to fight the imperialists and they're going to somehow be better than the US.
They pulled a race card on us all the time.
I mean, like, the US is very self-righteous, but I do think at the end of the day there is a lot of people who genuinely believe they're trying to do the right thing. Whereas I don't think that's the case with China. And to a certain extent, I respect China. Like, I respect the fact that Western countries will be like, oh, we're not going to deal with these corrupt governments that steal from their people. And China's like, well, if you don't, then we're going to fucking deal with them. We're going to go to Venezuela. We're going to lend the money that we know they'll never pay back and use it as a way to extort them for cheap oil. I kind of respect that, to be perfectly honest. Like, just, I don't know if the balls is right, but just like the naked self. Yeah, it's just it's at least they're not pussies. Like, they're evil, but they're not like self-hating pussies.
But, what about the People's Liberation Army, Serp?
I'm not. So, I don't believe this idea of Chinese paper tiger either, and I'm going to kind of explain what I kind of think of the view is. So, what he's talking about, he talks about, and he never explains it through the entirety of the book, so you kind of have to piece it together, is this idea of the tributary system of China. And so, the idea maybe that I'm trying to construct, that he never constructs throughout the course of the book, is that China will recreate a tributary system based on soft power. Now, I can kind of see this happening. Maybe it won't happen with Japan because of Japan's, the mutual hatred between them. But I can see this happening with Southeast Asia, where the Chinese economy, in a sense, becomes so big, and that the overseas Chinese have such a huge economic ability that Southeast Asia basically becomes a proxy of China. Now, I agree with this, but when you go so far to say that Australia will be a proxy of China, and New Zealand, and eventually the world, because he keeps like pushing the bars and boundaries and says China will grow indefinitely, and eventually its culture will overtake the world, and it'll become the hyperpower, and Mandarin will become the lingua franca of the world.
Does China export its culture, like, in any meaningful sense?
We all know that basketball American culture is the most dominant culture on Earth.
But regardless, Japanese culture has been exported more than Chinese culture.
Oh, incomparably. Like, I see more... Like, I see more Latin American stuff that's trying to reach a mass market than I see Chinese stuff that's trying to appeal to anything. The only reason I see a lot of Chinese stuff is just because Canada's like a Chinese vassal state. But, like, spreading their culture isn't, like, a big thing. I think, once again, that kind of gets back to the xenophobia, where it's like the foreign devils are just...
Mm-hmm. So I agree with this in the sense, I think the United States will fall out. China will recreate a tributary system, probably not in regards to Japan, because of the mutual animosity there. But China will push itself into a middle income. It will become like, its economy will be big enough, and the influence of the overseas Chinese within Southeast Asia will recreate this tributary system where these kind of like countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Laos, maybe even Thailand, definitely something like Cambodia, North Korea already, Burma, these countries will become economic vassals of China. But the idea that China will be able to expand this kind of tributary system over the entire world is stupid and crazy. And the reason that Britain and the United States, or even the total West, was able to do this is simply because of the power of the Industrial Revolution before the industrializing of the Third World. And that's why Western culture and Western power was able to extend as far. China will never be able to extend that far because the disparity in power which existed in that time, if industrialization is to continue indefinitely, will never arise again. So what's more likely than this idea of hyperpower would be a reemergence of a great power system or great powers with spheres of interests. And that's what I see much more likely as happening. That China will have this sphere of interest I just described, and that Russia will have a sphere of interest in the Slavic world or within Christians of the Mediterranean, which is exerting again. A country like Turkey will maintain a sphere of interest within the Muslim world due to this superiority of human capital over the Arabs. And, whatever is left of Europe will have some kind of global
who knows,
influence.
Japan might start building up one again.
Yeah, I think that Japan...
I don't think Japan
is going to become a tributary of China.
No, I
let
think
alone the
Japan
entire
will
world.
eventually be forced into rearmament and confronting China. Because
I don't think Japan will return to a tributary system because it never existed as a tributary of China in the first place. That's why Japan is an empire, has an emperor instead of a king, because they didn't want to fall under the tributary system. The guy is saying that Japan will naturally be forced by the size of wanting to trade with China into joining a tributary system, when historically, when Japan had no other option, it simply just isolated itself instead of joining a tributary system.
Resisted tribute to China. I mean, under the shogunates, for example, they typically would just trade with China using Okinawa as a proxy and use that to get around the need to pay tribute in order to trade with them. Yeah, just...
So I don't think that Japan will ever abandon the Westphalian model and return to a model that's never existed under the tributary model. Do you guys agree with me, this idea that China will have a sphere of interest and will become a great power, even in the vacuum of the collapse of I would say a collapse of the United States? It could never attain a hyperpower status. It's just like this fetishization of this guy that married this Malaysian Indian lady of like Western immaculate.
Well, is it also kind of a horseshoe theory thing where a lot of right-wing people, at least in the circles we move in, just hate America and they want anyone to take them down? And a lot of left-wing people either just hate America or they're naive and they think that China is actually like this anti-imperialist champion of the downtrodden.
Yeah. I think that we're predicated on this belief that China is more powerful than, like, that there's this natural order of one superpower or like one power that influences the world. And this is something that's been artificially constructed, which never even existed in the context of the United States and was artificially added on to the United Kingdom. And there's very special reasons that the United Kingdom and the United States were able to exert the power that they did.
Let me think. Who are China's actual allies? Like North Korea, Burma, I guess Venezuela, maybe?
Maybe Djibouti, but is Djibouti even a real country?
Not really. No, I mean there's
great
countries
name.
that they basically own because they just, but nobody likes them. Like a lot of people hate once again, the Soviet Union was also a pretty good sugar daddy. Like you just said, oh, we love socialism, down with imperialism. They give you like oil and weapons and money and shit.
I mean, China has Burma and North Korea. That's so good. The Soviet Union had Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, for the most part, historically, Egypt and Syria.
And isn't North Korea mostly a liability to China?
Well, I don't even think it's weird. They're a quasi-ally because they're also a liability to China, and they maintain their own, like, They're not even a tribute. They don't follow under this tributary system model. Even North Korea doesn't.
Well, they
Like
don't
North Korea
accept
might
China's
have
leadership.
even more ability to exert its power over China than China has. To exert its will over China than China can exert its will over it.
Well, it's like China is responsible for protecting them, but they don't get anything in return. We're like it's a
They
completely.
get coal, but like North Korea gets more out of China than China gets out of North Korea.
Well, I don't think it's even close. I guess the question, just someone posted in the chat. Do you think that at some point in time, Japan will develop nuclear weapons, or do you think
I said that multiple. I said that before already in this chat. I believe very clearly that Japan will develop nuclear weapons.
Probably, I'm
I don't
not
think
sure.
that there's any question.
I think an interesting question is whether countries like Turkey will.
I think Turkey very clearly will.
So basically, when the U.S. collapses, we're just going to go back to a less globalized world in which the great powers have their respective spheres of influence. Is more or less what you think's going to happen?
Yep.
Okay. Well, did you two have anything else you wanted to add?
I just wanted to do this impromptu thing. I think people have missed me.
Okay. Um, I think we covered the topic. Just it's getting kind of late. Is there any other points either of you wanted to make? I'll just wrap it up otherwise. Okay then. Well, thanks for coming on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
Once again, check out Terelien's podcast and check out Serp's YouTube channel. Good night, guys.
Serp is the best.
Disconnected.
Well, everybody, I hope you have a good evening. God bless, and more great content to come.